Well, hello everybody, this is Tim Breen with Rattle Magazine. Welcome to another critique of the week. So glad you could join me. It is Friday, August 11th. Sorry for missing last week. We were out at the San Diego Zoo with the kids, having a good time there. I was thinking maybe there'd be a way that I could do an alternative version of the critique, and then just didn't really have time and decided not to. So sorry for not giving you notice last week, or 2 weeks ago, that we wouldn't have a show last week, but I don't know. It was all right though. Sorry. I hope nobody showed up hoping for a critique and didn't get one. I tried to share it everywhere I could once I realized that I had to. But anyway, next week, with that in mind, we're gonna have the critique of the week a different day. It's gonna move one day to Saturday because I'll be flying on the Friday, so I'll be on a plane at that point. But then we'll be doing Sunday, so the people who work during the day on Friday will have a chance to join live for the first time in a long time. So that's nice. So it'll be the regular time, which is 4 p.m. Eastern, but we'll do it on Friday instead of Saturday next week, or Saturday instead of Friday next week, I should say. Well, anyway, we have a great set of poems here. It's one of those where I haven't read them yet, but I've looked out of the corner of my eye, and they look really good. Now we have 2 poems here, each by Sarah Vardaro and Erica Breen. So we'll give them a look. As always, the point of the critique is to give that workshop experience that's just so valuable, letting strangers, letting you know what works and what doesn't when you're writing. There's a lot of sort of blind spots we have as writers, assuming people understand things that we don't. Certain lines we might not realize feel cliche. There's things we can do better with line breaks, with storytelling, all sorts of things. Anything you can think of that can help improve these poems. That's always the goal, is to go through these and just help people make poems better, because that's poetry is an amazing, powerful thing. It's empowering and personally meaningful and spiritually meaningful, and sharing things in a way that others can appreciate is really important too. So that's what we focus on here. So leave as many comments as you can on the chat windows on Facebook and YouTube, and I'll pass along as many, but the poets can look here too. So who do we have here? So Margaret Doyle is here. John Atkinson is here. We have Mary Therese Taylor. Good to see you. Catherine R.W. is here as well from Australia. And then over on YouTube, we've got, Dick Westheimer, Katie Dozier, of course. She's making some potato salad in the kitchen right now. We've got James Langford. We've got Nate Jacobs here. Tom Barlow's here. Mark Grenier, D. Coleman, Erica Breen, one of the second poet. I think we have, she's coming up second, is here as well. Clayton Clark is here. Dick Westheimer, if I didn't say that already. Hey, Dick. So, here we go. Let's dive into these poems. And first up, we have End of Toil. And these are 2 poems by Sarah Vardaro. So let's take a look at the first one first. And I might have to jumble up let me see. I didn't set the screen thing right yet, so let me fix the right screen. It's going to be there. Okay. There we go. It's a little bigger too. Okay, so this is The End of Toil. And there's a little epigram to note the setting in Lotus, California. And again, the poet is Sarah Vardaro. The End of Toil. The machine strikes a spark against a buried rock. It's useless. Waist-high weeds wrap around the spindle. Early summer heat burns oil to smoke, and the machine quits. My body, too, unready for such tiresome work, falls in the shade of a locust tree hung with bells of blossoms. A small woman hired against seed, water, sun. The weeds, they grow on strange mounds. Maybe the tailings of a miner. The refuse of earth he sifted in search of the glittering myth of toil's end, but toil never ceases when the heart demands order in what can't be tamed, for weeds to be cut low, for branches not to hang, for rivers not to flood, for abundance to be abundant always. We want enough to stop the toil, but the weeds, who will cut them when this gold is found? That's Sarah Vardaro. One of those incessant kind of poems with the syntax there, not using any punctuation at the end of the lines, which leads to, there's a sense of sort of pressure and tension when you write a poem like that. But at the same time, sometimes it can get hard to follow and you sort of trip over things too. And so that's the thing to work out as we look at this poem, The End of Toil. Once again, we're in Lotus, California. Given the setting, I'm thinking about trimming the weeds, the forest fires, as well as the rivers, and floods and that kind of thing that we're working against. That's what work's really doing. Tom Barless is a nice sonnet, and it does appear to be 14 lines, so it'd be an American sonnet. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Yep, 14 lines. So it's an American sonnet, which is of course 14 lines, sort of free of all constraints, because that's how we live in America. We have no rules, apparently, and so that's the American sonnet. And as Katie Durr says, I like the way the syntax mirrors unruly weeds. And yeah, I like that too. And there's I like when you play with, so what a poem does when it does this kind of strange syntax and sort of forcing you not to read normally, is that it plays with your expectations of how the writing is going to go. And so, there's a tension on that, and there's a pleasant feeling, and it feels more creative. We were just on the way back from San Diego. We stopped in LA last night for Ana Caballero. She had a reading at some super fancy club thing, and but it was interesting thinking about that, listening to her book, which you saw featured on the Rattlecast just 2 weeks ago. Because she clips out so many of the articles and so many of the like verbs and things. I mean, she has this very stark, almost childlike sentence structure in that book. And what it does is, even as you're telling the story in its regular narrative, it changes the way you think about it. It makes it feel like a heightened sense of speech because it's a little different. And that little bit of offness sometimes could work. And I think that works in this poem as well for the most part. So let's take a look in a little more detail. The machine strikes a spark against a buried rock. So to be honest, this is the only line I read, and I was like, oh, that's a good poem. So we'll do that for the critique of the week. So what I do is I flip through these. Now, I used to do it completely random. Now I flip through it random and then read a couple lines to make sure there's stuff to talk about. And I read that line and thought, oh, that's going to be a good one. So the machine strikes a spark against a buried rock. I mean, the vividness of that. We have the title, The End of Toil. We have the location. So we're really set in the space, and we know kind of what's going on. We don't feel lost. And then we get a very strong image right off the bat. The machine strikes a spark against a buried rock. You can really see that very clearly. But then this did throw me off. This was this leap, because there should be some kind of punctuation here, but there's not. And then there's a comma here. So you trip over it, but then you're on the sort of the edge of, like, is it too annoying or too difficult to read or not? And I think not. The machine strikes a spark against a buried rock. It's useless. Waist-high weeds wrap around the spindle. Early summer heat burns oil to smoke, and the machine quits. My body too, unready for such tiresome work. And then we have, so the thing that if to me, and maybe this is a personal preference, but when there's no punctuation in a lot of places, I kind of want no punctuation anywhere, and I wonder, because the place, for such tiresome work falls, we need a comma there to make it a real sentence that you can follow, because the falls, it's my body too falling. And so you need that comma, but we have this stripped bare thing, so we don't have the comma, and it ends up, that part ended up being confusing to me. And so, but if we didn't have any commas and we're sort of forced to work harder, let me read it like that. If we can get through to this section without any commas, and will it be okay? Yeah. So let's see. The machine strikes a spark against a buried rock. Its useless waist-high weeds wrap around the spindle. Yeah, see, so it's it does get confusing. So now it's the weeds that become useless. So we really can't do that. So this is the problem with not using punctuation, is that we get into these situations where things get confusing, and how much can we follow? Let me just go back to where it was. Yeah, because if we lose this comma, then it becomes the waist-high weeds, and even with the comma, it should be, I don't know, yeah. So Scott says, I disagree with your assessment of the first line and jam it like a punctuation. I lost orientation. Yeah, it's like on the fringe of it. And I think if it held up, it would be okay. But the problem is we have these situations where we need the punctuation. And then here we would need it too to get the sentence right. So Nate Jacobs says, I confess I'm a lover of punctuation. Give me all of it. So what we see sometimes too is that we can use extra spaces instead of punctuation and still get that breathless feeling without sort of getting lost in this. So we can have more of a sense of where we are. You can sort of fill in the gap of what that punctuation should be. So we could do stuff like this. I don't know, but the syntax, yeah. So Dick Wester says, I really like it. See, the thing is, I like the sound of it, but then you end up in these like sort of traps where you can't really follow what the subject and the object are. And that's really, I mean, that's why we have punctuation. And so the trick is, like, how do you get this sort of breathless feeling without losing content, without losing our sort of access to what it's actually saying? Let's see. So Tom Barlow says, consider deleting the word, it's useless. We see that in the failure of the machine. So the machine strikes a spark against a buried rock. And then we just go waist-high weeds wrap around the spindle. Early summer heat burns oil. And then we get this sort of list, though. So you sort of, the other thing you run into risk of, and I'm not really an expert at this. Merwin is the one who's most famous, probably. W.S. Merwin is a poet who doesn't use punctuation very often. A lot of times there are poems without punctuation. And you have to sort of balance this aspect, too. There's so much to do when you start losing the punctuation, because punctuation is there for a reason and explains things to us. If you delete the it's useless, then you end up with this sort of where each line is a list and you lose the sense of enjambment. So if we had the machine strikes a spark against a buried rock, waist-high weeds wrap around the spindle, early summer heat burns, you end up getting this sort of like, it feels like it's a list instead of a speech. And so that's an issue too. And so the fact that there isn't enjambment there is important. So see, it's just very complicated to work out how to do a poem like this. So let me show you. I have a sonnet of my own, if I can be self-indulgent enough to do that, which uses no punctuation, and it's written like in the train form, like I call it. And it uses spaces, but see how I balance, and we'll do this, and I apologize, but we'll do it anyway. This is how I do the punctuation thing. And it's a sonnet, which is Crazy Uncle Joe. Not the most PC title anymore. We don't like the word crazy, but it's pretty old. So anyway, this is Crazy Uncle Joe, and this is written sort of for my Uncle Joe, and also in a combination of that and for someone at the group home I used to work at. And this is sort of a true story combining those two stories, actually. But this is a sonnet. But see how I avoid that list feeling so we can still use enjambment? Anyway, Crazy Uncle Joe. He piles his bricks alone, while overhead the basement skylight flicks incessant phosphorescent monochrome. He piles one brick, then two, then 106, scrapes slips the last so tight it barely fits, and thinks, no mortar there in ancient Rome, no glue, how lights were made by rubbing sticks, and they made do with it. They felt at home with just their fists, no mathemagic tricks for them, no sorrow in a dial tone, no wives so sad they'd slit their tender wrists to sleep forever still and stacked like stone. So he piles his bricks alone, his mind a startled bug, its shell outgrown. So that's Crazy Uncle Joe, and that is a sonnet. I think it's a Shakespearean sonnet. Yeah, and so you can see how I use, instead of punctuation, you get that breathless feeling by having the gaps here, where you can fill in your own punctuation. So when it's a quote from him speaking, it uses the gaps here, and you kind of fill in blank. You sort of feel like there's a shift, and you feel the quote there. But also having some enjambment allows it not to feel like a list as you're moving through the poem too. And so it's a difficult thing to balance in a poem like this. If we go back to the End of Toil, we're really having trouble balancing that. And so how can we, if you want to go in that direction, using spaces, extra spaces for punctuation, that's something that can really help. It's tough in the sonnet form because you have to have lines a certain length. I mean, in this, I don't think the machine strikes against buried. I don't think this is not. It's not syllabic or iambic. It's a totally American sonnet. But you still, with a sonnet, you kind of want lines roughly the same length, or else it starts to get, not look at all like a sonnet. And so maybe I don't know. So it gets tricky to work with the syntax. I mean, here it is in Creating Control. This is iambic pentameter. And so having the line lengths is important, and then getting the syntax to flow within the complexity of not using punctuation. Really, it's a tough thing to work out, and so we have to do that in this poem to make it more readable, I think. Let's see. I'm sorry. Stop. Don't want that. Okay, sorry. The YouTube chat thing was acting weird. So anyway, so I mean, it's a I think to the writer, again, this is Sarah Vardaro. You kind of got to decide how you play with this. Yeah. So maybe an M dash after it's useless. Yeah, I think we want to add. I think thinking about it more, I'm leaning toward more punctuation, but still keeping it light. Another thing you can use is a lot of M dashes. I mean, of course, Emily Dickinson, famous for using M dashes all over the place. And so maybe everywhere you need something, we could add an M dash for clarity, and maybe we could make the poem work that way. Yeah, so that's a good suggestion by Scott. That was Scott who suggested the M dash there. But somehow we have to make not have to trip over all the syntax. But I like the rushed kind of feeling. There's sort of, it makes you exhausted reading it. Mark Greener says another benefit of no punctuation is they can open up the lines to multiple interpretations as the language can read in multiple ways. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing. So Clayton Clark puts it, this is why I'm focusing on this so much, because the poem's good. Don't want to be this distracted. And yeah, that's the issue. So I think that's the main thing with this poem. But let me read it one more time. We'll see if we can, getting back to this, because I've showed so many different ways you can do it, and I don't want to, force a certain way out. But I think one of the ways has to be done. And Tom Barlow says, see, I hate, this is really annoying. YouTube has this new heart, which for me, I can't move it anywhere. It's like right over people's comments. I don't know. And I can't, anyway. But let's read the poem one more time for other issues besides we'll ignore the syntax issues and assume that Sarah will tackle that in some way, however she chooses. Yeah, I hate the heart. Yeah, I couldn't pin last week. I couldn't pin the Zoom link during the Rattlecast because that heart is in the way. You can't even click on anything. Like, why would they put a heart thing there? But anyway, and then it just feels like Facebook instead of YouTube. But anyway, okay. The End of Toil. The machine strikes a spark against a buried rock. It's useless. Waist-high weeds wrap around the spindle. Early summer heat burns oil to smoke, and the machine quits. My body, too, unready for such tiresome work. I said I was going to talk about something. I definitely think that we should add it where it belongs, and let this be sort of a run-on sentence. And I think that run-on nature of the sentence is enough to have you have a breathless feeling and maintain the energy. So I do think we should add punctuation, and just keep it one sentence until the end. I think that would work best. So I have a ruling on that now. I read it again. But anyway, early summer heat burns oil to smoke, and the machine quits. My body, too, unready for such tiresome work, falls in the shade of a locust tree hung with bells of blossoms. A small woman hired against seed, water, sun, the weeds. They grow on strange mounds, maybe the tailings of a miner. They refuse to earth. The refuse of earth he sifted in search of the glittered myth of toil's end. There's beautiful lines here. We haven't really talked about that in the detail because we got so distracted by the punctuation situation. But these, the refuse of earth he sifted in search of glittered myth of toil's end. And that's a great reverie on, having to work. And I was just ironically we were in Julian. So where we actually were staying in a gold mine town, and we toured a gold mine, and that search of not having to work, that freedom from toil is so apparent in sort of the ruins of what's left there. But toil never ceases when the heart demands order and what can't be tamed, for weeds to be cut low, for branches not to hang, for rivers not to flood, for abundance to be abundant always. We want enough to stop the toil, but the weeds, who will cut them when this gold is found? Yeah. So, Powder Down, he says they go for glistered. I don't really know what the word glistered. I'm not used to that. Glistered. And that is, like a wedding ring glittering. Oh, that's interesting. So it's a very close synonym for glitter. Very interesting. Okay. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, sorry, looking over the Facebook comments. Yeah, so anything else can we say about this sonnet? The glittered myth of toil's end, but toil never ceases when the heart demands. And so it has that the Volta sort of feeling there, where we shift into a different sort of mode of speech right around, right around line 8. And so that works too of toil's end, but toil never ceases when the heart demands order and what can't be tamed. And that's just it's so true. I mean, that's what work is trying to order things that are unordered. For weeds to be cut low, for branches not to hang, for rivers not to flood, for abundance to be abundant always. And so I love the poem up to here. Once we fix and add the punctuation that's missing, because I think we should. But then we want enough to stop the toil, but the weeds, who will cut them when this gold is found? At that ending, I think, yeah. The ending is a little too, I don't know, it's not surprising enough. It's sort of restating what we already have had, what we already know. Like, I think if we were not doing a sonnet, ending it there for abundance to be abundant always, because it implies that it's not going to be always. And I think that's more of an interesting turn than, even when he stops, even when he finds this gold, we'll still have to cut the weeds. That's not as interesting to me of a turn. I think that the last two couplets don't live up to the rest of the sonnet. And so I would play with trying to find some surprise here. Something that we don't expect. Exactly. So Nate Jacobs puts it this way, and you're always more articulate than me, Nate. He says the last two lines feel predetermined from the lines above, like the sentiment, but doesn't act as enough of a turn for me. Exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. Thanks, Nate. And so we want something a little more unexpected there. It doesn't have, yeah. So Katie Dozier suggests to make the line slightly longer and then make it a sonnet -1. So pull up. Well, I would just make the line shorter, actually. Let's just go ahead. Why not? I should. I'm kind of I would just get rid of that maybe, and maybe just leave it there. And then we could make the lines a little longer and then make it a sonnet -1, as Katie likes, and change, or just make the lines a little shorter and keep it 14. Yeah. So that's what I would do. We got to move on though. But I think we've talked about this poem enough. It's a good poem. I like a lot of the imagery. I like the ideas. I just want more. I want the punctuation not to confuse me, and a little bit more of a surprise, of a turn, of a sense of something unexpected. Because really, what we're doing, we talk about this all the time, but we're playing up with. The setup and then our expectations sort of being twisted. And there's this sort of surprise that, like, that's not exactly what I thought. Like, we talk about the way that humor and poetry, that and the aha are similar. And so much of that is surprise. It's like the peekaboo game with the kid is like the fundamental unit of poetry almost. It's like there's nobody there. Oh, daddy's there, and then the kid laughs. Because it's the sudden change, that surprise is something that, because what we're doing as human beings, how our brains evolve to work, is that we're making these models of the world around us on these different layers. And then when one suddenly changes and surprises us, we get this delight, and then we get to build a new model and shift that and change that and learn. And so that's the feeling that's sort of underlying so much of poetry. There's this whole dopaminergic reward system that fulfills that and makes us have a desire to update our maps. The meaning maps that we're always making. And so subverting that and giving us that surprise is like the underlying sort of joy of reading a poem. And so we want a little bit more of that there. We don't want to end on something that we knew was coming the whole time. And that happens a lot in submissions too. That a poem will be great, will be like, oh, these are great lines, and then it ends exactly where it began. And you don't have any of that sense of like something unexpected happening. And, and there's this way that it sort of should be unexpected, but also inevitable. And that's the real hard part of like making a successful poem. But a successful poem is something that starts somewhere and ends up in this both surprising and both inevitable place that sort of transforms, the way you are. It's a magic spell that transforms you from one state to another by making a change from one state to another. And surprise is a big part of that. Okay, let's move on to the next poem, and we'll spend a little less time on this one, I'm afraid, because we got to move on. But this is Me with All the Flowers. Rayleigh's Supermarket, Placerville, California. That's so funny because I've been there too on a road trip stopping for food. Not this, last year in Placerville. Yeah, I've been there. That's funny. Me with all the flowers. We collide at on-sale avocados. In so much need of support, you bend and lean, your hands curved into claws around the handle of the cart. Your tissue-thin skin, cream white, brown welts, where love once touched you, rough fingers forced to tenderness as one testing lettuce for wilt. Your bright red hat says you want the world to be a way that hurts, more hate, more guns, more death. I smile and say, sorry, I will always walk too fast, and at being recognized as a body of light, you crack into a field of golden poppies, a rare fall bloom. I need a license to drive this thing, you reply, blue eyes water, a summer rain. Then we go our separate ways, you with all your hate, and me with all the flowers you gave, a brilliant fleeting flash, and I won't deny what I saw. Yeah, and so Me with All the Flowers. So very interesting. So, let's look at this line by line a little more closely. Me with All the Flowers. I like the title a lot. It's a title that intrigues. And once again, we have the setting too, Rayleigh's Supermarket. I like it when poets do that because a lot of times we've gone through this a lot on the Critique of the Weeks, but we spend so much time just trying to figure out where we are in a poem. And so if you just let us know, don't make it a mystery. That's not the kind of mystery I was talking about before. Yeah. And so Dick Westheimer says too, I would punctuate this more conventionally. Yeah, I would too. I mean, I think the lack of punctuation is a detraction to both of these two poems. Yeah, and Katie Dozier too says, I love so many of the lines in this, but I'm confused by the hate references. And that too, that was my overall take back of that. PMB says they hate people with red hats. Yeah, and it's true. So, the hate feels, I don't know, it feels very judgmental, and there's nothing in the poem that, I don't know, that signifies that. So I guess that's my overarching feeling with it. It felt out of place. It feels, and it feels sort of prescribed in the poem too, and not organic, whereas everything else, all the other details in the poem are very organic. So let's read it again, though. And I assume, Tom Barrow says, was it a MAGA hat? And I assume so. So, and Placerville is definitely red country, by the way. Beautiful place, though. Full of fire risk. I notice that every time I drive anywhere. But anyway, we collide at on-sale avocados in so much need of support. You bend and lean, your hands curved into claws around the handle of the cart. Your tissue-thin skin, cream white, brown welts where love once touched you, rough fingers forced to tenderness at one testing lettuce for wilt. Your bright red hat says you want the world to be a way that hurts, more hate, more guns, more death. I smile and say sorry, I always walk too fast. And at being recognized as a body of light, you crack into a field of golden poppies. See, these are beautiful lines. A rare fall bloom. I need a license to drive this thing, you reply. Blue eyes water, a summer rain. Then we go our separate ways, you with all your hate and me with all the flowers you gave, a brilliant fleeting flash, and I won't deny what I saw. And so, so Dick says this is more rhetoric than poetry. And I think this, I don't know, I don't want to get into politics and any rattle stuff. But I think the poem is really interesting on a political level because of this. So your bright red hat says you want the world to be a way that hurts, more hate, more guns, more death. And I don't know how to say this, but there's a sort of a liberal bubble in which people think that everything on the other side is nothing but hate. And there's a conservative bubble in which they think the other side is the enemy. And there's this sort of myth, this sort of monster that we make our political opponents out to be in this country. And that's what this poem is really revealing, that monster is not actually a monster. And I think that it feels to me that rather than confronting that, which is the really interesting thing about this poem, the fact that this is actually a nice guy, despite the fact that I assume that your hat says you want the world to hate. It's saying that I know the hat means you want to hate. And there's something about that really is worth mining. And it's not, because it stays in that same place where people who disagree with me politically are evil. And that's just not truth. That's the kayfabe of the political rhetoric that we sort of buy into. But it's so much more complicated than that, and people are human beings on whichever side of the political aisle that you're on. And so if this poem dove into this, I think that's what it really wants to do. And it feels like the speaker in the poem here isn't really willing to make that leap into what that actually means, that this isn't a terrible person just because they have a MAGA hat. And I think that that's pretty interesting. Yeah, and so Nate Jacobs again puts it better than me. He says, trading hate for supposed hate is the easy response here. I prefer more surprising initial response to the hat. I do like the poem actually, just not the supposition. Yeah, and it's just, that's something that needs to be mined. It's just the world is so much more complicated than this political BS that we're fed on the news every day. And I'll get off my soapbox, but really, yeah. Yeah, and so, okay, so Sarah, so Sarah's here. It's a Sarah V on here. She says, yeah, exactly, this was an experiment in trying to address the distance we create between ourselves and those we disagree with. And yeah, so I think the poem hasn't gotten into that. It's a beautifully done poem. They're beautiful images, and it's a great setup for that. But there's no sort of sense that the speaker has sort of learned anything from this encounter, or has really... Yeah. And so I don't know. I think it has to be, I think we really want to mine into that, and that feeling of like, was I wrong? The poem doesn't question the speaker doesn't question itself. And maybe the speaker, doesn't, and that's sort of the point we're making, but that point doesn't really come across clearly or in a way that we can appreciate. Exactly. So Dick Westheimer says the poet has an opportunity to implicate herself in the polarization. And so what's really missing, and I hate, there's a weird way too, that I hate like the expectation that we're going to implicate ourselves too, like we have to make it a poem. But then a lot of times we have to make it a poem. And so it's a very complicated thing. But it feels like, that we need to like have some kind of awareness of that. Or maybe like a glimmer of that awareness, and then we we can see the person retreating back into those stereotypes that we're so built up upon, and so maybe that's how to do it. But we somehow have to interrogate this concept a little more than we do, because to me right now, just flatly, it reads like this person with a red hat has this sort of delusional hate, and I, the speaker, I'm not taking part in that. It's just like, why are they hateful even though they seem not? Whereas the real question is like, are they really hateful, and what does that mean to sort of be in a mindset like that? So that's where I go. So I think we got to dive into that a little more. Let's see. And Katie just has so many great lines here, Sarah, and so awesome line breaks too. Yeah. Okay. So, and this thing, so Dick Westheimer says, I am politically engaged in many of my poems. He's just disagreeing with Nate. And many of my poems, while not rhetorically, are influenced by those politics. And yeah, so there can be political poems, but a poem is a way of sort of solving problems non-linearly, or solving problems through creativity rather than rationality, or using the right brain rather than the left brain. And so a poem has to have some kind of, you can't know where the poem is going to go. You can't have the solution and make a good poem. And so the problem with political poems very often is that we have the idea that we have the answer, because that's sort of what we're fed by all the propaganda from both sides that we get constantly. And then the poem just has that like same starting point as ending point. And way political poems have to work is to actually engage on a deeper level and come to some, find the actual tension and the unknown in that, and then learn from the unknown. And that's how a poem can become a great political poem, which happens all the time. But the majority of them fail because they think they know the answer before the poem's even written. And that's not what a poem is. It's in search of an answer. So PMB says maybe rewrite from the perspective of the person in the red hat. And that would be interesting too. Or even just, there's a way, maybe you could, the narrative could shift, is like an omniscient narrator to see what the mega hat person does in the parking lot, or like after, or what happens, or maybe there's some way, there's a lot of opportunity in this poem to find a way to push at this actual tension a little more, which is the suppositions that we make about people. Yeah. This is great. So Sarah says, I almost never write about politics and social issues, so this is me extending myself, which is why I submitted these two poems here. So yeah, it's great. These are great. I'm glad you did. These are the perfect kind of poems to be submitting too, where the quality is there, and then we have a lot to talk about, which is why you could see just out of the corner of my eye, these are going to be good poems to talk about. Let me see if there's anything we can say quickly besides for the overall view. Let me read the poem one more time, stopping for maybe a couple comments, but let's see. So we collide at the onset. I already talked about the great title. Title's great, and setting us up is great. We collide at on sale avocados, and so much need of support you bend and lean. Just great descriptions here. We know right where we are. We see it so clearly. It's just great. Your hands curve into claws around the handle of the cart. I think maybe curve into claws is a little bit cliche. Maybe that could be taken a little bit more like by describing. It's one of those sort of slight cliches where if you describe it in a little more detail, it makes it not. Which is always an interesting thing. But anyway, around the handle of the cart, your tissue, thin skin, cream white, brown welts, where love once touched you. Another beautiful line. Your fingers forced to tenderness is one testing lettuce for wilt. That's great too. If being forced to tenderness. I love that phrase. There's so many great phrases in both these two poems. Your bright red hat says you want the world. See, I think it needs to say something like, well, it depends. There's too many ways to go. So I don't know. But one of the ways could be, I think, and add some kind of like, this is me interpreting you here. Unless you want to pull back and have a more omniscient narrator, and then we show it, that assumption as an assumption. But something could be done there. Your bright red hat says you want the world to be a way that hurts, more hate, more guns, more death. I smile. And so this is the rhetoric of the poem. And it needs to be clear that it is rhetoric, that the sort of the super god of the poem, the overarching knower, the actual author knows that it is. Like, we need to know that somehow for it to work as the way it's operating right now, maybe. Otherwise, you can hear how it's different from the voice of the rest. Like, to go back to the Ian McGilchrist, the bifurcated brain stuff, it is the left brain talking and not the right in that sense. And you can hear it. But I smile and say sorry. I always walk too fast. And it being recognized as a body of light. I love that. Being recognized as a body of light. Another great line. You crack into a field of golden poppies. More great lines. A rare fall bloom. I need a license to drive this thing, you reply. Blue eyes water, a summer rain. And it's a great description too. It's beautiful. Then we go our separate ways, you with all your hate and me with all the flowers you gave. A brilliant, fleeting flash, and I won't deny what I saw. Yeah. And so Brian also, it just comes down to that. They're beautiful, beautiful lines. And it's not as confusing, the lack of punctuation. I just don't think anything's gained, because when you do that lack of punctuation thing, what you gain usually is this, we were talking about it with the last poem, but you gain this sort of tension between what you expect and the sort of the difficulty. It's sort of like you make the poem more challenging to read, which sort of gives it more traction in a way. Like it's like a rougher surface, giving it more traction with like mentally. And then you get the speed too. The pace kind of increases too. And so you get a little more energy out of that. But with this poem, it's not the kind of poem that you're utilizing that. And so that's why I would punctuate it normally, even though with the shorter lines and the line standing in for punctuation and the line breaks, I should say, standing in for punctuation, I don't really get confused, but there's nothing gained. And so I don't think there's any reason not to. So I would do that. Mark Goodner says, good poem, publish it. And this is an interesting thing that we rarely talk about. But I think it's true that it's a good poem and you could publish it. But one of the things that we want the poems to be the best poems they can be too, and I think there's just so much more here. So I would not publish it in this state, and I would try to dig deeper into the tension of that, because it's a good poem, but it could be a great poem. And the fact that you could publish a good poem, we don't want to lose the fact that we could publish a great poem later. And I think that's what I would do. Because there's sometimes once you publish it, you think, oh, it's done. Somebody said it was, I got the stamp of approval from some magazine. And then we tend not to work on it anymore. But there's so much more to mine, to use the pun from the last poem, in this poem. Okay, I got to move on. It's late. But these are great. Thanks so much for sharing these. And thanks for being here, Sarah. This is, of course, it was Sarah Vardaro with Me With All the Flowers, and then End of Toil. And let's go to the next poet. We have Erica Breen here. There's Erica Breen. We have two poems, Water to a Horse, which you see like that, another non-punctuation, so we can see how that works, it looks like. And then the first poem, Farmhand. So here we go. Yeah, PMB says, I think it would get published because it reinforces the popular rhetoric. Yeah, that's the thing too. I mean, when we're talking about the rhetoric and the propaganda, there's no denying that one side, the poetry side, is mostly in one bubble. And if you agree with that bubble, no one cares. And if you disagree with that bubble, then there's no way this poem would be published. If it was from the MAGA perspective, saying, I can't believe that person wasn't an evil, baby killer or whatever. So yeah, that is interesting too. And you could, because it reinforces the thing. And I think, I don't know. I want poets to do more. That's all. I don't want, if you look at my Twitter page, the pinned tweet is a whole thread on why poetry is literally, like, technically the opposite of propaganda or art itself. Because propaganda is something where we have a preconceived idea and we're pushing it forward, and that's what propaganda is. And art is where we don't know where we're going. We're building order out of the chaos of human experience, and so that is what art is. So I'm not a fan of the propaganda poems, but they get published because we like our worldviews confirmed. Gosh, I'm being kind of harsh on poetry today, but it's true. Okay, let's keep going. Farmhand. The summer your son was one, we carried him from strawberry patch to sunflower row, setting him to play in the loose soil while we worked to plant seedlings faster than he destroyed them. Chubby fingers and chocolate drool, the plants a little root bound. So we tore the white threads open before we scooped a hole, settled them deep. Your son crawled faster and faster, he toddled, he ran, the sun grew tall and bloomed. We cut them from market Friday nights, felling the thick stems with our clippers, tripping the prickly leaves and stuffing the buckets on the rumbling truck, wedged together so they would stay upright on the dark lurch from field to road. You cared for that small, robust mystery, as for your farm, cultivating color, joy, and the will to flourish, biking together to the fair, soil and sun transformed to tangy puddles on the tongue. He must have lived on strawberries we picked on our knees, stained red, while we drank the sweet, warm scent. Now your son is 21. Mystery lingers. I work my own gardens, ask for him between the shining sunflowers at market. You still hold the earth, a few crumbs in your hand. Devotion, years of monarchs, strawberries, the soil like chocolate cake, all tender, I receive, I harvest yet. So another good poem. So I love the delicacy of the lines here. There's a way that certain, you could see that in the way that it just sort of forced me to read and appreciate the slow roll of the punctuation or of the diction of each sound, and there's a nice precision to it. And so that's the first thing I noticed. I like that aspect of it a lot. The summer your son was one, we carried him from strawberry patch to sunflower row. So again, we have farmhand. And I assume it's talking to the farmhand. So the son was one. But let's see. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm a little, so with the you, this comes up with the you poem, which comes up a lot. And I'm a little, lost about who the you is in a way that's not worth being lost. And so, like we had, I'm scrolling up so we could just remind how Sarah did this, where we have, all the flowers which are entering title, and we set it in the place. We could have the title that helps us a little more than by just saying farmhand. Is it the farmhand's son, or is the son becoming the farmhand, or am I the farmhand? And I was working, so whose perspective is this? I'm a little lost on who's speaking, and it takes a while to resolve that. And the thing about the human brain is we only have so much processing power. We have only so many things that we can work on with our attention, and so you're working on that, which is something that we could easily just tell us, and we're wasting time that we could be engaging on like an emotional level with the poem. And so help us out by letting us know who the farmhand is, and who the you is, and who the speaker is early on in some easy way that we can get to right away, so we don't have to waste our time with that. So farmhand, the summer your son was one, we carried him from strawberry patch to sunflower row, setting him to play in the loose soil while we worked to plant seedlings faster than he destroyed them, chubby fingers and chocolate drool, the plants a little root bound. So we tore the white threads open before we scooped a hole. Yeah, and so, it seems to me, and I think this is what Mark Grenier says, it seems to me, and this is my interpretation, so I think it's, well, actually, Mark Grenier says the you seems to be a parent of the boy. And I don't think... I think it's the parent of the owner of the farm. And it's speaking from the voice of the farm. And I think they're trying to work while he's out making a mess of the field. I think that's what's happening. And I think Yeah. And so PMB says it doesn't matter to me. It could be the narrator, the child, the parent. Yeah, and so it just leaves us not understanding what happened. And, PMB says they don't care. And maybe there's a way, if there's enough other things to care about, and there can be sort of ways in which you play with the fact that we don't know, if there's a real purpose to not know. But we spend so much time trying to figure it out that we don't get to engage with the poem as much as we could. And so, so Clayton Clark says lots of great imagery. I do want to know who's who. Yeah, so we get let lost. So I think it's we end up just spending too much time piecing that together, right? I do think it's the farmhands are the speaker, and the son is the owner of the farm. That's what I think. That's my supposition, but I'm not 100% sure, and I should be, if I want to engage in the poem. Anyway, so we tore the white threads open before we scooped a hole, settled them deep. I like the images. It's very tactile, and we can feel it. We just don't know who's who. Your son crawled faster and faster. He toddled. He ran. The sunflowers grew tall and bloomed. We cut them. See, I love there's a great rhythm to these two sentences too. Your son crawled faster and faster. He toddled. He ran. And then we get this. So this is sort of a run-on compound sentence, even though it's short. And then we get this sort of blunt statement, which is a lot where really nice, nice lines of poetry come a lot of times from simple, blunt statements. The sunflowers grew tall and bloomed. And that gives us time to breathe and slows the whole thing down. It's really nicely paced in this section especially. We cut them for market Friday nights, felling the thick stems with our clippers, stripping the prickly leaves and stuffing the buckets on the rumbling truck. Wedged together so they would stay upright on the darkening lurch from field to road. Again, great descriptions. So Attractor says maybe it's the farmhand speaking to another farmhand, or else the owner speaking to the farmhand. I think the speaker is the farmhand. See, we're really confused. And it's just a great example. This is why we do Critique of the Week. Because I think you might think as the author of a poem like this that we know and we're following along because like you have the whole story in your head when you're telling a story. and we only get the sounds, we get the phonemes that we get. And so, we're sort of feeling left out of this poem. And I think just making it clearer would really help. The sunflowers grew tall and bloomed. We cut them. Oh, I already read this. Yeah, but that's great descriptions throughout this section too. You cared for that small, robust mystery as for your farm. See, now here it's your farm. So I think I'm right. I think everybody who disagrees is wrong. I think it's the farm hands talking to the owner of the farm. It's the son of the owner of the farm that's the you. So you cared for that small, robust mystery as for your farm, cultivating color, joy, the will to flourish, biking together to the fair, soil and sun transformed to tangy puddles on the tongue. And so this is the point of the poem. So we have there's a structure in a lot of poems. There's sort of like a setup and a punchline, and it feels at this point like we've been set up beautifully and we're just waiting for the punchline, the sort of meaning to emerge from this sort of world that we've conjured through this imagery and setting the story. And so I'm kind of at this point, I'm waiting for that. And so that's what's going to... So he must have lived on strawberries we picked on our knees, stained red while we drank the sweet, warm scent. And so here I'm starting to I'm starting to worry that there's going to be no punchline coming. Yeah. And now your son is 21. Mystery lingers. So the mystery lingers doesn't tell us much. And it's a strange thing to insert in a very generalized, vague way. So I don't know what to do with that. I work my own gardens. Ask after him between the shining sunflowers at market. You still hold the earth, a few crumbs in your hand. Devotion, years of monarchs, strawberries, the soil like chocolate cake. All tender I received, I harvest yet. And so the ending to me, this is the thing with the poem. I think it's great on almost every level. There's the confusion of who's who, which we can so easy to fix just by the title or an epigram or a little bit of description in this first line. Like right here, you can fix that problem. It's really easy. But then I feel like we don't have, and we have a great setup with beautiful lines, great line breaks, as someone mentioned, and a great sort of pacing to it too, which I've been talking about, and nice images. So we're really engaged with the poem in a nice way. But then the conclusion, sort of where it goes. Now your son is 21 and mystery lingers. So we're wondering, like, where is so Mark Grenier says he grows up and disappears. Yeah, so we're wondering that. But I don't know. There's not a lot of... That didn't seem like the conclusion to it, though. Like there's something more to it than that. Now your son is 21, mystery lingers. I work my own gardens, ask after him between the shining sunflowers at market. You still hold the earth, a few crumbs in your hand. Devotion, years of monarchs, strawberries, the soil like chocolate cake. All tender I received, I harvest yet. And so it sort of doesn't go anywhere with the mystery of where'd the sun go. And I think there's a way that a poem, really a real poem, going back to this concept, which I think is true. So earlier on, somebody said, where was it? Simone Levine said, art is a big part of socio-political commentary. Irish protest poems, American election cartoons, blah, blah. Yeah, they're things shaped like poems. But my position, and I think it's not art, because art is it's propaganda. Just because it rhymes doesn't mean it's creating order out of the chaos of human experience through the music of speech. And I think, and so, but the point is, because every poem, every piece of art, every piece of thing that you're creating artistically has something that's like gnawing at you that makes you want to write that makes you need to write that makes you need to draw that painting to make that vision appear. Like there's something on a deep level, like something in the stuff of dreams that makes you, that there's a mystery. Billy Collins, when he talks about it in our interview with him, says he's like a bloodhound sniffing out the trail. And you can go back to every poet. They always have this way of talking about like following the scent of an idea that means something they don't quite grasp. And then they grasp it and they know what they knew they didn't know, and they know they didn't know they knew, and all that stuff. And so this poem, there's a reason why this wanted to be written. And is it really that the boy has gone away? And what happened to the boy? That question? Because that could be. Or could it be there's something else here about the way that the farmer cared for the farm, and maybe not the boy too, because he's not there at the same time. There's something there that you can feel beneath the surface of this poem that was driving it to be created, but I don't think it's fully explored in this ending. And I think that's what the poem wants to be. Exactly. Yeah. So anyway, so I think that this it's sort of set up the thing, but it hasn't really, in a very similar way to the last poem at the supermarket, where we had this tension between the expectation of the MAGA hat person and then reality, and that wasn't really explored. It was sort of noticed, but then it wasn't like interrogated, and it wasn't mined for all the deeper truth that it has in there. In the same way, the story has some personal significance that we can kind of feel. I can sense it. I don't feel like it's been mined with the ending. It's sort of set up, and then it's not. The fact that the sun's gone is an interesting thing, in that there's nice lines here. That I like the like chocolate cake. All tender I received. There's a tender I received sort of hints at where the poem's curious, what the poem's curious about, but it's not really mined there yet. Yeah. Brian Sun says maybe it's about how love for a person who is going to leave is different from love for land, which stays. I mean, that's interesting. Like, there's a lot of ways you can go. And you could even do it. It doesn't even have to be long. Like we talked about with the very first poem, those last two lines that were surprising or were not surprising. You can go, we picked, how could we, let's see. So you cared for that small, robust mystery as for your farm, cultivating color, joy, the will to flourish, biking together to the fair, soil and sun transformed to tangy puddles on the tongue. And then you could go to like a philosophical place, like, like where, what goes of the sense the tongue tastes or something, and then find a thread there that just sort of leaves us thinking about that concept, given this circumstance. There's a lot of ways to do it, but it seems like it just hasn't done it yet. So it's a poem that's unfinished. Like, it's a great setup waiting for its sort of resolution. Mark Grenier says hands seem important to her. Yeah, and I think so too. I agree. That's part of what's going on. Having touch, there's a tenderness, and the tenderness comes up at the very end too. The tenderness of the farm. I don't know. There's something deeper that we just don't have access to right now. That's like lodged in the author's subconscious, and it hasn't quite emerged yet. And PMB says maybe it's about the relationships we cultivate with long-term employment. And hands could become a central symbol, says Mark Kuhner. Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot. It's like a ripe fruit. It's like waiting to be plucked, but we don't really know what it is yet. And so that's where this poem's leaving us stand. And so how to get to that? People have different ways of doing it. One of the things I like to do is just free write, kind of just make, like I would do, which I do so rarely because I usually write sort of poems in one sitting. But if I had a poem like this, where I knew there was a great setup and there was something I hadn't gotten to yet, and I wanted to work at it, what I would do is type out the lines by hand and sort of let my mind wander as I'm doing that, and then let myself trail off in different directions and see if I go somewhere surprising. Writing, he must have lived on strawberries, and then whatever sort of spontaneously comes up, you can get into that space where you don't quite know what you're about to write. And so, yeah. So Mark Goodness says, keep working on this. There's a really good piece in it somewhere. I completely agree. Yeah. And so I would just do that. Keep trying to just mine that through that sort of free writing type exercise and see what comes up, because I think it's a great start, and it just hasn't drawn out its conclusion yet. Let's look at the other poem before we go. And this is Water to a Horse. Water to a horse. She lowers her head, sinking into a long, slow swallow, sucking the water through lips larger, floppier than my hips, sucking the water up into her throat, up the lengths of my arching forearm, until it cataracts down, water falling into her gullet. Her ears ripple as we listen. Throw-wop soft, throw-wop soft, throw-wop soft. The rhythm slows me, quenches my thirst. Her eyes float with thanks. So that's a beautiful. I love this section with a throw-wop soft. Seeing it like coming, I didn't know it was gonna like sound so perfect, but it really does. So I like that aspect of it. Let's see. She lowers her head, sinking into a long, slow swallow, sucking the water through. This poem to me feels like it could be shrunk. It's the first poem. I think my advice is going to be to shrink it. But I think it could be. It's such a simple, sort of beautiful image to it that it feels like it's one of those things that could be cleaned down into a really tight, concise poem that I don't think I've seen Sharon Ferrante yet. But the kind that Sharon Ferrante loves. The Kay Ryan, the Mike White, the very short, very, very diamond-like compression into a poem, or even haiku. No one's mentioned haiku yet, but almost the kind of thing. But I like that throw-up slurp thing too. And so, so I think we could get a little bit more out of it just by, I think the poem's already here, and it's just sort of pulling back a little bit. And I think, people are saying they like it over on, City Putnam Guntherman says, I like the horse poem. Margaret Doyle loves it. Sydney says it could be a haiku too. Yeah, I think it couldn't be just because of the highlight to me is that onomatopoeia of the slurps. And you can't really do that in a haiku because it wouldn't come out right. Yeah. And PMB says, I like poems that reflect on such momentary, often unnoticed things. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think we can condense this down, though. And so what could we do with that? We'll just do that with this poem, because that's the easiest thing to do on a critique, too, because I can just cut stuff. So she lowers her head, sinking into a long, slow swallow. I think it's a great start. Water to a Horse is a good title, because we've situated in it. Sucking the water. And also Water to a Horse. There's a depth to that title, too, that's sort of more surprising than you would think maybe on the surface. Because the water has a different meaning to the horse than us, but then the same too at the same time, because we're all animals. And there's a satisfaction of that, the quenching of a thirst, that we both have sort of so much complexity thrown on top of it, but then also the sort of simple urge behind it too. So, yeah. Katie Dozier, though, says, I love the music here. I love a title that turns it into an extended metaphor. Without it, it feels more like a beautiful description than what it could be. But I think that's that too, maybe. Anyway, nice takeoff on the old adage, says Mark Grenier. You can bring a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. She drinks. So Katie Dozier says, I also prefer the title change to being an extended metaphor because it becomes very clear that they're bringing water to a horse within the poem. It does, so it's sort of unnecessary. Can you think of a metaphor that this would be for? Give us an example. We'll give you time. I'm curious. I like the water to a horse though, because it's something that you don't. It's a cliche or an idiom. But I don't know what it means, water to a horse. Maybe I think it's more interesting than it is because I don't know what that means. Water to a horse. Isn't that like an expression? Well, it's you can lead a horse to a water, but you can't make them drink. Is there something is that just referencing that? I've definitely heard people say water to a horse before, but I don't know where. Is it just? Let's see. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just that can't make a drink thing. So what is the old adage? Is it that you can lead a horse to a water, but you can't make him drink? Or is it referring to something else? Because Mark Grenier says, a nice takeoff on the old adage. Oh, he said it right there. Yeah, okay. Sorry, Mark. Yeah, so... Okay. Horse. I don't know. I think the title's interesting. But we'll leave that for Katie to think of something. Gratification, she says. So if the title was gratification, so it's an extended metaphor, so we talk about all gratification through this horse. That could be interesting. Let's look at a poem. We're past the hour, but I want to carve this poem down a little bit to show how it can be helped by being a little tighter. She lowers her head, sinking into a long, slow swallow, sucking the water through lips larger, floppier than my hips. And so I would say her lips floppier than my hips. So, I mean, that gets the same thing, but much fewer words. Sucking the water up into her throat, up the length, and I would do, we know it's water already. Right now the poem's called Water to a Horse, so we don't really need sucking up the water up. So just like that, up into her throat, up the length of my arm. I'd just say arm. Until it cataracts down, water falling into her gullet. Her ears ripple as we listen, throw-wop soft, throw-wop soft, throw-wop soft. The rhythm slows me. And I would cut that too, because it's got a little bit cliche, or not even cliche, just melodramatic or something. PMB says pulling would be better than sucking. I think I agree too, but I would just cut that. I don't think it's necessary. And so I would trim it down to that. And I like the float. Her eyes float is such a strange... At first it feels strange, but then they're floating with the water even though they're not really. So that's really interesting too. So I like that. And that's all I would do. I think I would trim the poem just to this. Katie suggests gratitude is the title. So then you could think about it meaning more. Let's read it like gratitude with this, with these slight condensions just to make the poem a little stronger. And we'll see how that feels. Gratitude. She lowers her head, sinking into a long, slow swallow, her lips floppier than my hips, up into her throat, up the length of my arm until it cataracts down, water falling into her gullet. Her ears ripple as we listen, throw-wop soft, throw-wop soft, throw-wop soft. The rhythm slows me, her eyes float with thanks. I don't know if we get that it's a horse without saying it's a horse up there. Yeah. So I think I'd go back to Water to a Horse. That was it, right? Water to a Horse. I think I'd go back to that. Yeah. I think D. Coleman's saying without the horse you wouldn't know it's a horse. And I think you do. And I think you could say she lowers her horse head or something like that, if you wanted to. But I think the title works. I think water, because there is this way that it sort of means, it makes me think a lot about the way that we're animals, and that it means a lot more to us because we have all these sort of complicated concepts of things and think more about big pictures, like, oh, they need, but to a horse it's just thirst, but then to us it's just thirst too. So, yeah, so I think I like that title. I think you need it. And then it's a horse right away, so you don't get that lost like you would otherwise. The other thing, Mark Grenier said that we need, where is it, the quenched line. Erica says, or where was that comment? So Mark Grenier says, you need the quenching line for the poem to work. And I don't think you do. I mean, all that's it's implied that it's quenching a thirst. I mean, obviously the horse is like very happily taking the water. And the fact that the rhythm slows me, that turn to the self, implies that it's doing something for me too. And so I think that the quenching, saying it quenches me, and how would it, I wish I didn't, do I still have, I didn't make a copy. Let me see. If we go back, quenches my thirst. So the rhythm slows me, quenches my thirst. That's implied there because we're noticing, the act of noticing this implies that there's something, a connection that's happening on a personal level, and that it's slowing me, and that it's doing something for me too, to be able to quench that thirst, which is part of the poem. I don't think, and to me, that's just too, too telling, and too sort of expecting us not to get it. But I think we do get it. Let's see. Mark Grenier says, but it is the girl's thirst that is being quenched. Yeah, the thirst for that feeling of quenching someone's thirst. But I don't think we need that. I really don't. I think the poem is much better without it. Yeah. Okay. So that's what I would do, just to condense that poem a little bit. Because there's stuff that's not necessary. And you don't lose anything by having, taking those through the sucking and a little too much description that loses the poetic concision that we had going on as a real strength of the poem. So I would just trim that a little bit, but I think it's a great poem. It's good to go. So thanks for sharing that, Eric. I think that might be Mary Teresa Taylor bringing up something. So I wonder about this too. So she says, a fantastic title, Water to a Horse. It turns the proverb around just to make the point. Not so sure about the anthropomorphic ending. And that's what I was thinking too. The with thanks, I don't know. Does a horse really, and maybe I just don't know enough about horses and their brain. Do they really feel thankful? Or maybe it would be just with gratitude. Because thanks implies it's a very personal, an anthropomorphic kind of thing. The concept of thanks, because thanks is directed to the person who you're thanking, right? And a horse, I don't think, has a concept of self and others. Do they? Are they high enough consciousness to have that, where they realize that the thanks is due to somebody, and not, and not just like, yay, this was here. It does feel more like a gratitude. I think maybe gratitude would be a better word. Or some other word that's a little less directed. But maybe, I don't know. But I'm not like a horse. I think I've probably petted a horse once, but that's about it. But maybe, yeah. Sydney Putnam says her eyes float with relief. That's the kind of concept I mean. I mean, it's something a little less human. Dana Doobie says some horses do. So maybe I don't know. That's one thing I'd think about. And I didn't bring it up because I'm just not sure about that aspect of it. But it was something that sort of I wondered about for a second. So I'm glad you pointed that out. And Mary Therese. Do you have anything else? I missed this too. Kimberly McNeil says cataracts, and with a question mark. Question that word choice. I think that's used because cataracts is the eye. Let's see if I'm right. I mean, that's the cloudy eye, but isn't the cataract also like a water, like a, what do we call it? Like a flute? Or is there a different word? A cataract. Yeah, a cataract. It does mean it's a another word for waterfall. Okay. Yeah, water rushing over a precipice. Yeah. Okay. So that is the same word. I was just wondering if it was a different, sort of a near homonym or something like that. But it's not. It's still, cataract just has two definitions. But thanks for pointing that out too. It's something that I wasn't sure about. All right, we're going to wrap up the show with that. Katie Dozier, though, says, let's say this. So Katie Dozier says the floating implies thanks. And that's something I wondered, too. Does the floating, I almost said that. Her eyes float. Does the float, see, I thought if we do this, the rhythm slows me, her eyes float. Does the float imply thanks or indifference there? Because I thought maybe we could just do that, but then it felt to me like it was indifference, like they would float with indifference unless we had, with gratitude or something. I would go with gratitude. But anyway, that's something to tinker play with. But it's a good poem. I just love that throw up soft. It just works. It's got a great set of lines, and the fact that you use three, I think it's really wonderful. Yeah. So Tom Brown says float doesn't imply thanks to me. He just says it implies thanks because they are safe, floating on the water, quenched. Yeah, I could see that too. And maybe it's too ambiguous, though. I don't know. Think about that last line. in that. And if I think the author probably knows a lot more about horses than most of us do. So maybe the thankfulness. And maybe that is an accurate description. I just don't know. I questioned it though. I wondered. So anyway, thanks for sharing these. A great 4 quartet of poems here by Erica Breen. First on Water to a Horse. And we had Farmhand. And then we had a couple poems that were wonderful too by Sarah Vardaro. We had that with Me With All the Flowers and The End of Toil, American sonnet there. So thanks for sharing those. Those were excellent. A lot to talk about this week. It was really fun. Now we are, let's see. This week on the Rattlecast, let's do that. This week on the Rattlecast coming up, we have Natalie Padilla Young, and the book is All of This Was Once Underwater. Natalie we hadn't published her in a long time, but she was in our speculative poetry issue. I was very interested in that sort of genre, fiction sort of aspect of poetry. I haven't read the book yet because I do it over the weekend, but I think that's what this is too. I think it's a speculative fiction type poetry book, but it also has beautiful art by Maximilian Speck. I can't really see what that says, but whatever that name is, it's beautiful artwork throughout the book too. It's a hardcover copy that I got, and it's a great poet and a really interesting book. I'm looking forward to reading this when I get a chance to. That's going to be the guest on Monday for the Rattlecast number 206. And your prompt for this week was to write a letter to a favorite poet, but also include a suggestion in that letter. So that is your prompt for the Rattlecast. Open lines. 206 is the episode, and don't forget that next week we're going to be right here for Critique of the Week, but a day later than normal. And we'll go back to Fridays. It's not a permanent change, but I'm going to be in the air, or at least close enough to in the air that I can't do the show on Friday, so we'll do it Saturday instead and get people who are working during Fridays, and that's great too. That'll be Rattlecast, or that'll be a Critique of the Week next week, and also Rattlecast 206 on Monday. Hope to see you then. Hope you have a great weekend in the meantime, and I will talk to you later. Goodbye.